What if I told you that before Yahweh, the God worshipped by millions of people around the world, there existed another powerful God, worshipped in African lands, whose memory has been carefully erased from history? We're not talking about a simple tribal legend, nor a mythological figure lost to time, but a real deity, feared and revered, whose influence extended far beyond Africa's borders. A God whose symbols, rituals, and teachings echoed for centuries, crossing seas, influencing cultures and shaping traditions that would later be associated with Yahweh himself. Today, you will discover a secret that has been hidden for millennia, a secret that could forever change the way you understand the Bible, history, and even your own faith. Brace yourself, because what we're about to reveal isn't found in Sunday sermons, isn't found in best-selling theology books, and certainly won't be shared in major religious institutions. This is the kind of knowledge that shakes structures, that raises dangerous questions, that troubles those who control the narrative. Why was this African deity erased? Who decided she should disappear from Scripture? And, most importantly, what remains of her hidden between the lines of sacred history? Throughout this video, we'll delve into archaeological records, ancient texts, and surprising comparisons between African myths and biblical accounts. We'll explore how rituals, sacred names, and divine attributes of this mysterious entity were reinterpreted, or rather, appropriated, to create the image of Yahweh we know today. You'll understand how ancient symbols crossed oceans and how ancient stories were rewritten to fit a new religious paradigm. But make no mistake, this isn't just a journey through ancient history. What we'll cover here has profound implications for the present. By exploring the roots of this African god, you may discover connections to spiritual traditions still alive today, practiced in various parts of the world, often without people realizing their origins. And these connections reveal something disturbing, that the spirituality we've inherited may be far more diverse, hybrid, and multicultural than we've always been told. Imagine for a moment an ancient map with lines drawn connecting temples in the heart of Africa to altars in the Middle East. Imagine finding symbols carved into ancient stones, identical to those found on Hebrew artifacts. Imagine reading an ancient text, written centuries before the Bible, describing a God with characteristics and commandments almost identical to those attributed to Yahweh. This is not fiction. These are clues that history has left for those who dare to seek them. And that's exactly what we'll do here: seek, connect, reveal. We'll show the parallels, expose the coincidences that may not be coincidences, and confront the question many prefer to avoid. Was Yahweh the only God from the beginning? Or did he take the place of another whose memory needed to be erased to establish a new spiritual realm? Over the next few minutes, we'll cover everything from the origins of this African deity and its representations to the spiritual and political wars that led to its replacement. We'll discuss historical censorship, lost texts, erased inscriptions, and rituals that survived in hiding. We'll explore this figure's connection to central concepts of faith, such as justice, power, creation, and destiny. And I'll tell you right now, the further you get into this video, the harder it will be to see the story the same way again. But to understand the true impact of this revelation, we need to take the next step and delve into the heart of the mystery, the moment when the two deities intersect in the narrative and a power struggle begins to shape the faith of billions. Therefore, I'd love to hear your thoughts on everything we're revealing here. This is a topic that stirs deep-seated beliefs, challenges official versions, and can open doors to a much broader understanding of humanity's spiritual history. So, share with me in the comments. Have you ever heard of this African deity? Do you think Yahweh really replaced or erased his memory? Or do you believe this is all just historical coincidence? Your insight is crucial because it's through dialogue that we can further deepen this investigation. If this content is making you think differently, if it's opening your eyes to details you'd never heard before, then please leave a like now. This helps YouTube understand that this is an important video and that more people need access to this information. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and activate the bell, because in future videos, we'll bring even more impactful revelations about hidden mysteries of the Bible and spiritual connections that have been hidden for centuries. Your participation is what keeps this investigation alive and allows this knowledge to continue spreading. When we talk about the presence of African cultures in the ancient Middle East, we must imagine a world much more connected than textbooks usually portray. Trade routes cut through deserts, crossed seas, and carried not only goods, but also ideas, symbols, and beliefs. African peoples were not isolated in one corner of the continent. They moved, waged war, traded, intermarried with other peoples, and most importantly, spread their worldview and spirituality throughout regions that, centuries later, would become the primary setting for biblical narratives. Consider the ancient Egyptians, the Nubians, the peoples of present-day Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, who had a direct influence on the lands of Canaan, the Sinai Peninsula, and even the cities that would later become part of Israel's history. Archaeology reveals something fascinating: inscriptions, stelae, and reliefs that show African warriors and traders circulating in Mediterranean ports, participating in political alliances and bringing with them religious symbols that, over time, were absorbed or deliberately modified by local cultures. These exchanges were not merely economic, they were profoundly spiritual. A symbol carved in stone, a ritual song, or a sacred name carried powerful meanings that, when encountered by other peoples, were reinterpreted and even attributed to different deities. And here we enter the realm of religious syncretism in antiquity. This word, syncretism, may sound academic, but in practice it means something very simple. When two cultures come into contact, their beliefs blend, creating a new form of worship. Imagine that one people revered a god linked to the sun, while another worshipped a deity associated with justice and destiny. Upon meeting, these images merged, and the result was a new god who carried aspects of both originals. It's as if faith were a great river, receiving waters from different tributaries and following a renewed course. This is precisely what happened in several regions of the ancient Middle East. African peoples brought their gods, rituals, and stories to lands where others already had their own deities. Coexistence, military alliances, and even wars ultimately created a hybrid religious landscape. It is in this context that it becomes plausible, and even likely, that an African god came into contact with the Hebrew tradition, leaving profound marks before officially disappearing from the dominant narrative. The problem is that history, almost always written by the victors, doesn't always preserve these connections. In many cases, the replacement of one deity by another wasn't peaceful. When one people conquered another, they often imposed the worship of their own god as a sign of power and dominance. And for this new faith to be accepted, it was necessary to erase or rewrite the records of the previous god. This could be done in a variety of ways: destroying temples, prohibiting rituals, replacing sacred names and texts, and even adapting characteristics of the old god to incorporate them into the new. This practice not only eliminated a spiritual competitor, but also strengthened the image of the victorious god. Thus, attributes, stories, and even miracles that belonged to a previous god began to be counted as deeds of the new. If you stop and think about it, this explains why we find striking similarities between gods of different cultures: identical symbols, nearly identical creation narratives, flood stories, prophecies, judgments, and promises of an afterlife. All of this circulated in a cultural melting pot that inseparably linked Africa and the Middle East. And herein lies the importance of revisiting this topic to understand the origins of faith. If we ignore these connections, we end up believing that religious traditions were born in isolation, as if they had fallen from the sky in a single place and for a single people. But the reality is much more complex and, at the same time, much more fascinating. Understanding that faith was shaped by encounters, exchanges, and influences does not diminish its power. On the contrary, it broadens our understanding of how human spirituality is capable of adapting and surviving. This perspective also helps us identify the extent to which certain beliefs we consider original may actually be inherited from other traditions, adapted and rebranded. When we analyze the details, we realize that symbols we now associate exclusively with the God of Israel, for example, may have been used long before by African peoples. And this raises an intriguing question. To what extent was Yahweh built on an already existing foundation, shaped by external influences, and to what extent was this foundation obscured to reinforce a narrative of exclusivity? If this question is already stirring in your mind, it's a sign we're on the right track. The truth is, to fully understand biblical history, we need to look beyond the pages of the Bible. We need to observe the cultural and political backdrop that shaped every word, every symbol, and every commandment. And when we do so, the religious map of the past ceases to be a straight line and becomes an intricate web of connections that span continents. While you're reflecting on this, I want to plant a seed. What if part of what you believe came solely from the Hebrew tradition is actually a distant echo of an African cult that almost no one remembers? Let this question haunt your mind, because in the next sections, we'll begin to trace concrete clues of this African presence in the roots of the faith we know today. But first, tell me in the comments if you've ever heard of the term religious syncretism and what you think of it. Write it exactly like this: I see the connections, so I know you're following this investigation closely. Have you ever stopped to think that behind the familiar pages of the Bible there may be names and stories that were deliberately ripped from the collective memory? Imagine opening an ancient scroll, dusty with time, and finding on it the name of a God who doesn't appear in modern worship, but who, for millennia, was revered as the Lord of creation, protector of peoples, and guardian of spiritual laws. This is not a character invented for shock value, but rather a real figure who left visible marks that can still be seen in inscriptions, symbols, and rituals that have survived, albeit fragmentarily, to this day. His name, echoed in the chants of African priests, was engraved on stones erected long before Israel existed as a nation, and carried attributes that would later be associated with Yahweh, but with one fundamental difference. This god had deeply African roots. In archaeological records found in regions that now belong to Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, and parts of the Levant, it is possible to identify references to a deity who united the power of heaven and earth. He was not merely the god of war or fertility, but the center of a spiritual system that governed moral laws, protected communities, and guided kings. His attributes were clear: unwavering justice, protective strength, dominion over the waters and the heavens, and the ability to punish unjust nations. Isn't it intriguing to note how similar these characteristics are to descriptions of Yahweh in later texts? This raises an inevitable question. Are these similarities the result of coincidence, or are we witnessing a historical process in which one deity was gradually replaced by another, retaining some of his traits so that the transition could be accepted? In some excavations, archaeologists have found temples aligned with astronomical precision, dedicated to a god whose name, in some ancient linguistic variants, can be translated as "he who came before the sun" or "the eternal of the horizon." These temples housed reliefs depicting a majestic figure, surrounded by rays and light, holding a scepter in one hand and a symbol of eternal life in the other. It's impossible to ignore the magnitude this image represented for the people of the time, and even more impossible to ignore how this iconographic pattern appears in adapted form in later texts and traditions from the Middle East. Ancient documents preserved on parchments and tablets also reveal prayers and hymns that extolled this African deity as creator of heaven and earth, defender of orphans and widows, and judge of the nations. The similarity to biblical passages is almost unsettling for those who believe these ideas arose exclusively within the Hebrew tradition. For many independent scholars, these records are evidence that the faith we know today was built on older foundations, whose stones can still be found, but which have been deliberately covered by the dust of time and religious politics. The most curious thing is that in the oral traditions of certain African communities, stories about this god remain alive, albeit adapted to the local context and mixed with later influences. It's as if his memory endures, even after centuries of attempts to erase him. These narratives speak of a time when the world was governed by immutable spiritual laws, delivered directly by this god to leaders and priests. They speak of miracles attributed to him, of liberations, of direct interventions in the history of entire peoples. What if these same miracles and stories were later transferred to another deity, to consolidate a new dominant cult? Examining seals, coins, and amulets found in trading regions between Africa and the Middle East reveals that the symbol of this deity, often a circle with rays surrounding it, or a centralized eye, was reproduced and reinterpreted in Hebrew and Canaanite contexts. Some of these objects date from periods before the formation of Israel as a unified kingdom, suggesting that the influence of this god was known even before the emergence of exclusive worship of Yahweh. It's not just a question of archaeology, but also of identity. Recognizing that there was an African god revered before and possibly alongside Yahweh changes the way we understand humanity's spiritual history. It opens the door to seeing that faith did not emerge in isolation, but rather as a result of encounters, exchanges, and even disputes between deities and their worshippers. and in this process, some names were elevated, and others condemned to oblivion, or, at the very least, to official silence. This silence, however, is not total. There are fissures in the dominant narrative, small details that escaped censorship. A verse in an ancient text that mentions a Lord of the Horizon, in a context that doesn't fit with the traditional use of Yahweh. A stone inscription, found in a place of worship, bears symbols identical to those seen in African shrines. A story preserved in a Coptic manuscript that describes the struggle between two gods for dominion over a nation. It is fragments like these that allow us to reconstruct the presence of this forgotten god. And it is at this point that I want you to stop and reflect. If these records exist, even if fragmented, and if they show such a strong similarity between the African god and the God who became central to the Bible, what does this tell us about the true origin of monotheism as we know it today? Was Yahweh always the only one, or did he inherit and transform the garments of a previous god to construct a new religious narrative? This is where the investigation begins to take on even more intriguing contours, and I want to know if you're ready to dive even deeper. Before we continue, write to me in the comments, "I want to know the forgotten God." That way I'll know you're following this journey with your eyes wide open and that you want to see this revelation through to its conclusion. As we enter the most delicate part of this investigation, we begin to see the lines that almost invisibly connect the African God we introduced earlier and the figure of Yahweh who dominates the biblical narrative. And I want you to realize that this isn't about forcing a comparison, but about observing parallels so clear they would be impossible to ignore. It's as if we were looking at two different paintings, created in different eras, but both based on the same original sketch. In the myths preserved in African oral traditions, this god was called He Who Rules the Waters and the Heavens, and the Judge of the Nations. Now consider for a moment how many times throughout the Bible we find Yahweh described precisely this way: the one who parts the sea, the one who controls storms, the one who judges kings and peoples. These descriptions are not merely poetic, they carry the weight of a divine function that was already attributed to another entity long before the compilation of the Hebrew Scriptures. There are also symbols. The African god was often depicted with a radiant circle or solar disk, surrounded by rays, a symbol of light, power, and eternity. In the first centuries of Israelite history, before strict monotheism was imposed, there is evidence of symbolic representations of Yahweh associated with solar forms and rays of light, something that was later abandoned to avoid any trace of visible idolatry. This change does not erase the fact that, in its early phase, the worship of Yahweh may have absorbed visual elements from African and Mesopotamian deities. In ancient inscriptions found in Sinai and regions of Canaan, there are titles that intrigue scholars. One of them, loosely translated, is the Lord of the Ancient Heavens and Waters. This phrase appears both in older African texts and in some rare Hebrew fragments that were not included in the final compilation of the Bible. Another title common to both is the All-Seeing One, or the Eye That Judges, connected to the symbol of the centralized eye, present in African temples and which, curiously, finds parallels in descriptions of Yahweh's omniscience. In ancient texts from cultures neighboring Israel, there are accounts of alliances and wars waged in the name of the God of the Horizon, whose physical description and attributes closely resemble those later applied to Yahweh. These texts suggest that different peoples may have been referring to deities who, in practice, were interchangeable, or at least inspired by the same original divine figure. Another remarkable coincidence lies in the creation narratives. The African god was described as the one who separated the upper waters from the lower, who organized chaos and established order in the world. If you open the book of Genesis, you'll see this exact action attributed to Yahweh. The burning question is, are we dealing with a universal tradition that has been adapted, or was this account inherited directly from older African cultures? There are also little-known passages, rarely discussed from the pulpit, that reinforce this connection. In an ancient manuscript preserved in an African monastery, there is a prayer that reads, "O Lord, who is above all and who cannot be overcome, who judges righteously and guards his people with a strong hand." Now compare with Exodus 15:3-6, where Yahweh is exalted as a mighty warrior whose right hand shatters the enemy. It's hard to miss the parallelism of language, function, and character. Even the relationship with the chosen people is a point of intersection. The African god demanded a pact, an agreement of obedience and fidelity in exchange for protection and blessings. This pact was sealed by blood rituals and sacred meals, something directly echoed in the covenants Yahweh made with Israel. The similarity is so great that some independent scholars question whether we are not looking at the same concept, simply dressed up with different names and symbols. What makes it all even more intriguing is that in the oldest texts of the Bible, before the final edits and revisions, Yahweh is sometimes described as one among other gods. This raises the possibility that at some point in history, he was identified or conflated with an already existing deity, possibly the very African god we are exploring here. Understand that we're talking about more than just superficial similarities. This involves a profound overlap of founding myths, sacred symbols, honorific titles, and divine functions. It's as if someone took the essence of an already known god, rewrote his name, and adapted his story to serve a new spiritual and political project. And here I want to pause for a moment for you to reflect with me. If the parallels are so obvious, why have we never heard of them in traditional religious settings? Would acknowledging these connections threaten the notion of exclusivity and originality that underpins certain doctrines? And further, could understanding these connections give us a broader and more honest understanding of how faith has formed over the centuries? Before we move on to the next point, where we'll delve into the direct implications of this possible fusion between deities, I want you to comment below, "I see the parallel." This sentence will show me that you're not only following along, but also realizing how revealing and, perhaps, transformative this investigation is for those willing to look beyond the surface. When we begin to bring this revelation into the present, it ceases to be merely a curious detail of ancient history and begins to carry enormous weight in how we interpret the Bible and even our own spiritual identity. Many people grew up believing that the biblical narrative, as we know it today, emerged in isolation as pure and original content without external influences. But when we see that there are clear and profound parallels between Yahweh and an earlier African deity, the entire structure of this perception begins to shake. It's as if we're looking at a painting we've always considered unique, and suddenly we notice the marks of an earlier work beneath the paint, a work that tells a different story, perhaps broader and more connected than we imagined. For Christian communities, this discovery can be both disturbing and liberating. Disturbing because it challenges centuries of doctrine that place the origin of faith as something exclusively linked to the Hebrew people. Liberating because it opens space to understand that God, or the supreme deity we seek, may have manifested himself and been worshipped by different peoples in different forms and names, long before the formation of the organized religions we know today. This removes faith from a rigid mold and places it as part of a much older, more dynamic, and more plural spiritual flow. For Afro-descendant communities, the impact is even more profound. For centuries, African heritage was devalued, erased, or pejoratively associated with pagan practices. Many were taught to sever any connection with their spiritual roots, as if accepting the Christian faith meant abandoning the memory of their ancestors. But what if part of this faith, part of this God so many follow today, was already worshipped by their own African ancestors, long before it reached the West through colonization? What if, deep down, the faith many consider imported carries in its spiritual DNA symbols, myths, and principles that originated on the African continent itself? This realization changes everything. It restores dignity and prominence to African cultures in the history of global spirituality. It shows that Africa was not only the recipient of a foreign faith, but also the source, cradle, and inspiration of central elements that make up what we call the biblical tradition. It's as if, instead of seeing faith as a road that came from the Middle East and stopped in Africa, we realize that it is, in fact, an intertwining of paths that begin, intersect, and feed off each other. And here comes a sensitive point. This revelation also sparks debate within religious circles. Some will feel threatened, because accepting that Yahweh may have inherited or incorporated aspects of an earlier African deity means recognizing that biblical monotheism, in its consolidated form, is the result of a historical process of cultural fusion and adaptation. Others, however, will embrace this view, understanding that divine revelation is not limited to a single people or a single narrative, but manifests itself in different places, with different languages, to reach different hearts. In today's world, where people increasingly seek meaning and connection with their origins, this discussion can rekindle interest in a more authentic, conscious spirituality, less restricted by artificial religious boundaries. It can inspire community leaders, researchers, and believers to revisit ancient stories and reclaim what has been lost or silenced. It can even unite people who previously saw themselves as on opposing spiritual paths, but now recognize they share a common heritage. And we can't ignore the psychological aspect of this revelation. Knowing that one's faith has African roots can strengthen one's sense of identity, pride, and belonging. For someone who grew up hearing that their traditions were inferior or wrong, discovering that the foundation of the faith they follow originates in their own ancestors is transformative. This breaks the cycle of inferiority and opens space for a spirituality that recognizes and values itself. Furthermore, this connection to the modern world also highlights the need to question official narratives. Why, even with so much historical evidence, is this part of history not taught in schools or preached in churches? The silence surrounding this issue is strategic, because acknowledging these origins would force a reinterpretation of sacred texts and the history of faith itself. And such reinterpretations for many institutions are seen as threats to their authority. But, on an individual level, understanding this connection can be liberating. It can open doors to studying the Bible with a more critical and, at the same time, deeper perspective. It can lead to seeing the similarities between traditions that previously seemed opposed, and to realizing that, behind the different names, there is a common quest for the sacred. As you listen to this, I want you to ask yourself a sincere question. If this African heritage within the faith you practice has always been there, why has it been hidden? And what changes in your spiritual life if you decide to accept it as a legitimate part of your story? I want you to let this reflection mature, because we'll still delve into details that make this connection impossible to ignore. And before we move on to the next part, write in the comments, "I recognize my roots." This sentence will show me that you're grasping the weight of this revelation, and that you're ready to follow me even deeper into this investigation. As we reach this point in the investigation, we enter the realm where assumptions give way to something much more solid: evidence. Here, we're no longer simply interpreting narratives or comparing myths, but analyzing concrete evidence that has stood the test of time and that, silently, tells a story that isn't found in school books or Sunday sermons. This evidence is found in stones engraved millennia ago, in forgotten parchments, in works of art that survived destruction, and even in the accounts of ancient travelers and historians who recorded what they saw with their own eyes. Among the most impressive archaeological discoveries are inscriptions found in regions that are now Sudan and Ethiopia, dating back to long before the formal establishment of the Israelite religion. These inscriptions not only mention names and titles that resemble those later attributed to Yahweh, but also describe divine deeds and attributes that sound incredibly familiar to those familiar with the scriptures. In some cases, literal translations of certain terms reveal direct parallels, such as "He who rules the waters" or "the Lord of eternal justice," expressions that could easily be found in the Old Testament. We also find temples and altars that display artistic representations of this African god, imposing, standing figures with symbols in their hands representing life and power, surrounded by rays or luminous halos. Interestingly, similar structures and symbols have appeared in excavations in ancient Canaan, suggesting not only influence, but also a possible continuation or adaptation of religious practices. The evidence doesn't stop there. There are accounts from ancient historians, both from the Greco-Roman world and from Arab and African chroniclers, that mention the presence of African cults in Middle Eastern lands. Some describe processions, chants, and rituals involving sacred objects carried in arks or mobile structures, something that inevitably reminds us of the Ark of the Covenant. Others speak of sacrifices and ritual banquets sealing alliances between leaders and deities, a practice we also find in the oldest Hebrew traditions. When we compare the rituals, the similarities are even more difficult to ignore. In both ancient African cultures and early Hebrew tradition, we find the consecration of sacred objects with anointing oil, the use of incense as a symbol of prayer and purification, and the practice of annual festivals to celebrate harvests and liberation events. Even the sacred calendar shares similarities, with festivities linked to lunar phases and seasonal changes. Symbols are also a separate chapter in this investigation. The rayed solar disk, for example, present in many African temples, appears in objects and ornaments used by Hebrew kings at certain times. The staff and scepter, symbols of spiritual and political authority, are common in both African art and biblical representations of leadership, and the famous all-seeing eye, found on ancient African amulets as a sign of divine protection, resonates with the Hebrew concept of a God who sees all things and judges justly. Another point worth highlighting is sacred architecture. In several regions of ancient Africa, temples were built with an extremely private interior space, accessible only to priests, where it was believed the divine presence resided. Any similarity to the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Jerusalem is no coincidence. This configuration is not exclusive to the Hebrews, but an element inherited and adapted from much older traditions, which already recognize the need for a restricted sacred space for the manifestation of the divine. The ceremonial surrounding pacts and alliances also provide strong evidence of connection. In ancient African texts, we find the practice of dividing an animal in half as part of a solemn oath before God, exactly what we read about in biblical passages about alliances. Even the idea that blood plays a central role in the ratification of a pact is shared by both traditions, revealing that we are not dealing with mere cultural coincidences, but rather with a shared spiritual foundation that has been shaped and adapted over time. Furthermore, linguistic findings reinforce this connection. Certain names and expressions used in ancient African contexts have phonetic roots similar to Hebrew terms used to describe the divine. These linguistic connections indicate that, at some point, there was contact and exchange of religious concepts between these peoples, whether through trade, migration, or even political and military alliances. Now, I know all of this may be uncomfortable for those who have always heard that the Bible and the faith it represents arose in isolation, without the influence of other cultures. But the evidence is there, etched in stone, preserved in manuscripts, and echoing in traditions that still live on, albeit in fragmented forms. And to ignore it is to close one's eyes to an essential part of humanity's spiritual history. This is the time for you to reflect with me. If so many similarities and concrete evidence exist, why is there still so much silence on this subject? Is it because it disrupts structures that don't want to be shaken? Or is it because acknowledging these roots would require an honest rewriting of the history of faith? Before we move on to the next part of this investigation, I want you to write in the comments, "I see the evidence." This will show me that you understand the seriousness of this evidence and that you are ready to continue with me in the search for a truth that has long been kept hidden. Now that we have covered the most concrete evidence, it is impossible not to enter the most sensitive territory of this investigation, the hidden side, that which was deliberately erased, modified, or simply pushed into the shadows of history. And when we speak of concealment, we are not talking about innocent forgetting or the simple loss of records over the centuries. We are talking about conscious decisions, orchestrated movements to ensure that certain memories were eliminated, and that only a specific version of events survived as the official truth. One of the most compelling reasons for the exclusion of this African deity from the official biblical narrative may have been the desire to consolidate a single, centralized, and indisputable religious identity. Imagine a society attempting to unify politically, with leaders seeking to strengthen their power and control the spiritual narrative. In this context, having an exclusive God, with non-transferable attributes and a pure history, without competition, is a powerful tool for social cohesion and control. The existence of another, earlier God, even more ancient and possibly venerated by neighboring peoples, threatened this exclusivity. This type of spiritual dispute was not uncommon in antiquity. Conquering peoples often replaced or absorbed the gods of the conquered peoples, but with one caveat: the new God needed to be presented as the true one from the beginning of time. This involved rewriting stories, adapting myths, and reinterpreting symbols so that the new cult would appear to be the sole and legitimate expression of the divine. Thus, traces of the previous divinity were erased or absorbed into the figure of the new God, until the original became unrecognizable to future generations. The censorship and rewriting of history in this process were not limited to burning manuscripts or tearing down statues. They included the careful selection of which texts would enter the sacred canon, the editing and alteration of passages to remove names and uncomfortable references, and even the creation of parallel narratives to replace the originals. Texts that mentioned rival deities were reinterpreted, transforming them into false gods, idols, or spiritual enemies. The curious thing is that, even with all this effort at erasure, certain traces have escaped. Small enigmatic references, words that seem out of place, divine titles that appear and disappear in different contexts. All these are clues left almost like cracks in the veneer of official history. It is in these fissures that we can glimpse the shadow of this African god, like an echo resisting the imposed silence. And this is where we enter into a direct connection with spirituality. When you realize that part of the history of faith was shaped this way, your way of relating to the sacred begins to change. Spirituality ceases to be a passive repetition of dogma and becomes an active search for understanding what lies behind words, symbols, and rituals. This revelation also opens the way for reconciliation with traditions that have long been demonized or marginalized. If the practices, symbols, and even core ideas of what we now call official faith already existed in African cultures long before, why continue to treat these cultures as pagan or without light? On the contrary, recognizing this spiritual heritage is like recovering a lost piece of our own collective soul. And this reconnection is not just historical, but practical. Many ancient African rituals, linked to this forgotten deity, emphasized values such as justice, protection of the most vulnerable, harmony with nature, and respect for the cycles of life. These are principles that, curiously, are also at the heart of the purest messages of the biblical tradition, before the layers of political and institutional interpretation. This means that seeking these roots does not mean abandoning faith, but deepening it. By bringing this connection to light, we open the door to a broader spirituality, one that is unafraid to look beyond the boundaries imposed by official history. A spirituality that understands that the divine can reveal itself in different ways to different peoples, and that all these paths, when authentic, lead to the same source. This not only strengthens the identity of Afro-descendant communities, but also invites anyone, regardless of their origin, to recognize the richness of a plural spiritual heritage. But this rediscovery also brings a challenge, dealing with the discomfort that arises when we realize that what we considered immutable has, in fact, been shaped by human decisions, some of them motivated by interests far removed from spiritual purity. This requires the courage to ask questions that may never have been asked in your religious circle, and the willingness to seek answers that can forever change the way you view your faith. And it is precisely at this point that I want you to reflect. If part of what you practice today was born from traditions and symbols that were purposefully erased, isn't it time to learn about this history and consciously decide what it means to you? Before we move on to the next part of our investigation, where we will delve deeper into this bridge between the African god and the spiritual practices that have survived to this day, I want you to say, "I do not fear the truth." This phrase will show me that you are willing to face these questions fearlessly, even if they challenge what you have always believed. When we reach the point of understanding the connection between this African god and spirituality, we realize that what is at stake is not just a detail lost in time, but a key that can open our minds and hearts to a much broader vision of the sacred. This knowledge doesn't just serve to satisfy historical curiosity. It has the power to expand how you relate to the divine, to faith, and even to yourself. It's as if you suddenly realize that spirituality is not trapped within a single tradition or culture, but is a living river, crossing borders, languages, and eras, always carrying the same essence, albeit in different forms. Knowing the story of this African god can spark a true inner revolution. First, because it shatters the myth that divine revelation is limited to a single people or territory. Second, because it reveals that the search for the transcendent has always been a universal human movement, manifesting itself in diverse ways but guided by the same force. And third, because it places in your hands a heritage you may not have known you possessed, especially if you are of African descent or have some connection to African culture. When we look at the African religious traditions that have survived, even after centuries of oppression, slavery, and colonization, we perceive echoes of this same God in their rituals, symbols, and teachings. In various regions of the continent, we find deities linked to the sun, the sky, the waters, justice, and creation, attributes identical or very close to those we associate with the biblical God. These figures, although given different names depending on the region and ethnic group, carry the same function of maintaining cosmic order and protecting the righteous. Furthermore, African spiritual practices, such as the celebration of natural cycles, the use of elements like water, fire, earth, and air in rituals, and a deep respect for ancestors, demonstrate a worldview where everything is interconnected. This notion of interconnection between people, nature, and divinity is something that, curiously, we also find at the core of the Bible's most profound teachings before they were filtered by centuries of religious institutionalization. It's as if this African god hadn't completely disappeared, but remained present, disguised, and adapted in various forms of worship spread throughout the world. In the African diaspora, for example, traditions such as Candomblé, Santeria, and Vodun preserve, each in its own way, fragments of this spiritual vision, where the supreme deity and his messengers act in balance, justice, and care for creation. And, if we look closely, we'll see that these traditions share moral, ethical, and spiritual principles very similar to those of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. Understanding this is liberating because it breaks down artificial barriers. It makes clear that spirituality doesn't have to be a prison, but rather a space of encounter, where different paths can lead to the same source. Knowing that Yahweh may have shared roots with an African deity is like finding a missing piece of the puzzle of faith, and by putting it back together, the complete picture becomes clearer and more beautiful. This knowledge also invites us to have greater respect and openness toward other religious traditions. Instead of seeing them as rivals or threats, we can recognize them as different expressions of the same search for God. This doesn't diminish our existing faith. On the contrary, it enriches and deepens it, because it shows us that the Creator is not limited to a single language, a single people, or a single form of worship. But it takes courage to embrace this expanded vision. We're often taught to distrust anything outside our religious box, as if looking outside were an act of betrayal. However, the truth is that knowing these connections brings us closer to the divine essence, because it helps us see the unity behind diversity. It's as if God Himself were saying, "I have always been with you, in every possible way, wherever you sought me." And perhaps this is the greatest treasure of this discovery, realizing that you are not separated from a spiritual heritage that dates back to ancient times, that has crossed oceans, resisted empires, and survived all attempts at erasure. This heritage is yours, whether you are aware of it or not, and knowing it can completely transform the way you pray, meditate, and live your faith in your daily life. Now I want you to stop for a moment and think, how would your spiritual life change if you knew that the deity you worship today was already revered by your ancestors in a different way, but with the same essence? How would this affect your sense of identity and belonging? Let this question resonate within you, because in the next step of this investigation, we'll delve even deeper into how this connection shapes practices and beliefs that remain alive today. And before we move on, right here in the comments, "My faith is older than I thought." This sentence will show me that you're open to seeing your spirituality from a deeper perspective, connected to your roots. If you've stuck with me this far, it means you're part of the select group who truly seek the truth beyond the surface. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for following this investigation to the end. Now, to continue spreading this knowledge and breaking the silence that exists on this topic, I need your help. First, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because in future videos I'll bring even more impactful revelations that will complete the puzzle we started to piece together today. Second, leave your like. This lets YouTube understand that this is relevant content and shows it to more people who need to hear this message. And if you made it to the end, I want you to comment below, "I made it to the end of the revelation." That way, I'll know you're one of those who really dives deep and isn't afraid of the truth. And don't leave without continuing your journey. The next video is already appearing on the screen. Click it now and let's go together to the next part of this investigation that could forever change the way you view history and your own faith.